Okay. So thank you, Shahid. Thank you very much. After giving that very generous introduction, maybe I should stop talking and start listening. But nevertheless, I have a few things to say, and for this one, I've sort of put some ideas together, and my ideas have actually coalesced around this one question, which I sent to Allah a day or two ago: is there a place for more than one moral economy? Because that question emerged from my readings of the literature, at least the literature that I have been looking at for the last couple of years around this question of moral economy. And so it seems to me that one has to basically ask or argue, if, is there a place for moral economy? I hope there is, but I think the question is open. And I think we, to a certain extent, we got some answer to that from some of the papers who are saying, there is a moral economy. But I think the literature generally tends to say that, we are under a hegemonic moral economy of the market. And so that is also part of the inspiration for this conference and for this rounds of thinking, that we can actually start thinking about religious reform as providing an opening, a possibility of starting this question, because they are obviously you know thinking about providing an alternative, uh, and it is for us to basically pursue that question. So, part of my discussion, part of my reading of this literature has persuaded me that there are two people who really stand out. One of whom we have heard, E.P. Thompson. He has played a very, very important role. He's been called a prophet or a father. He's played a very important role in identifying, at least in the last 20 or 30 years, what moral economies are. I haven't looked at his 1963 book, but certainly these two essays I would highly recommend. 1971 and 1991. The distinction between those two is that in 1971, he wrote his major thesis, or like Asonze was saying, that he did that in 63 already. And then 20 years later, in 1991, he reflected on it. But not only did he then confirm his thesis, but he also shared with us, the reactions to his thesis about the moral economy, particularly the reaction of neoliberal economists, historians, who basically were not accepting the thesis of this moral economy that he wanted to speak about. And I think so. I think it's worth reading those two essays together with each other. What E.P. Thompson was doing, as we've heard, is that he was trying to identify bread riots. What is the meaning of bread riots? And he was dissatisfied with the idea that bread riots were just simply an emotional outburst from the masses, from poor people who were rioting because they didn't like the new economy that was emerging. They didn't like the prices of bread, for example. And he says one has to look a little bit deeper at what these bread riots mean. And in general, his thesis was emerged that there are two different moral economies that were competing with each other. The one is a moral economy that was beginning to emerge, and the old moral economy. I'd like to take this quote from him just to refresh our memory again. It is possible to detect on almost every 18th century crowd action some legitimizing notion. By the notion of legitimation, I mean that the men and women in the crowd were informed by the belief that they were defending traditional rights or customs, and in general, that they were supported by the wider consensus of the community. I mean, I think the key word there is that there's some kind of a set of ideas that informs an alternative, a different way of doing things, and also a way by which you could actually justify why you are doing something like this. And this was essentially in the bread rise, it was about that during times of crisis, particularly during drought or famine, the state should come in and control a price and set up a sort of an upper limit of what the bread price should be. And he was, that was one of the key issues about, how do you have the state or somebody coming in and interfering in the market, or do you let the market continue? And they were arguing against, so E.P. Thompson first spoke about this is a moral economy, the one that I've described in this quotation. But then he also considered that the new economy also was a moral economy. The new economy was a market economy, it was also moral. But it was defined as an order of nature rooted in natural human sentiments. And that Thompson basically shows us the justification of this new moral economy, through people like Adam Smith in his book on Wealth and Nations and other books as well, where he describes the economy as an order of nature. as a kind of a universal way in which one has to think about relations. At least market relations are not determined by, by particular religion or particular culture, but it is determined by the very nature of things. Apparently, Smith was very much influenced by Newton at the time, who thought that, the same way that we can think about a model of the universe, through the model of the atom, one can also think about the model of the economy or the model of politics. So and it actually echoes what I think with what Faisal was talking earlier about this manual, the textbook that you have to have when you open an Islamic bank or when you go for any bank as such. This model which actually assumes, I think importantly, as universal sentiment, both that this is what human sentiments are driving this economy, and the economy is actually moral. It is universally moral. So these are the competing, moralities of that E.P. Thompson, at least the two moral economies that he articulated. I think that I'd like to add to Thompson, a person who actually inspired us to look at this question a few years ago when we decided to read him in our reading group, and that is the work of David Graeber. David Graeber has done some really wonderful work on the history of money and how money is valued, and also on the broader moral economy that he speaks about as such. David Graeber focuses much more. I think in a way, David Graeber, before I show you the quotation, I just took it away quickly, that I want to emphasize that Graeber thinks about the moral economy as defined or as characterized by debts and obligations. So I think that perhaps that provides some kind of a definition for us. We might agree with it or not, but I think it is a very compelling argument. And I think that it can provide a very useful way of perhaps adding something to the moral economies that Thompson identified. Much more substantially, I mean, it is a sort of a universal perspective again, and we might disagree with that, but certainly it is something worthwhile thinking about. So in this quotation, he speaks about a sacrifice. What is a sacrifice, performed in a religious, in Vedic India, for example? What does it mean? He says, a man being born is a debt. By his own self, he is born to death. And only when he sacrifices does he redeem himself from death. This speaks to the extent, the depth of the debt that we owe, to the universe or to life. The fact that you are born means and you are born and that you are inevitably going to die, shows you that you have to be, that the life that you get, you have to somehow pay for it with death. So the life that you've got is actually a debt, and you can only pay for it because you are going to die. But if you perform a sacrifice, maybe you can redeem yourself from it. So this, in a sense, speaks to, it's a particular interpretation of a sacrifice. I'm not so sure whether you agree with it, but for me, it sounds very compelling. Maybe it also seems to be a kind of very interesting, maybe perhaps a definition of what the sacrifice or what the crucifixion of Jesus actually means. His sacrifice as somehow redeeming everybody else who is actually going towards, inevitably to a death. But David Graeber presents it as a debt, as a human debt, and we have lots of other debts as well that we have to sacrifice. So he comes up with this kind of Durkheimian perspective, which gives a very broader understanding of, I think, a definition, a sort of almost like a universal understanding of debt and obligations. I think it is a very modernist definition, but let's read it and see. All religions are simply ways of recognizing our mutual dependence on one another, a dependence that affects us in a million ways that we are never entirely aware of. God and society are ultimately the same. So as you can recognize that last, God and society are ultimately the same, that's a Durkheimian phrase. But what Graeber is actually doing is that he's inserting this dependence, this obligation and debt in the heart of the meaning of society. And I think from that universal perspective, he goes off and says, how do we actually pay our debts? How do we redeem our debts? How do we evade our debts? How do we actually make other people more indebted than in one way or another? Graeber basically goes on and speaks about three moral principles of economic relations. I think these are These are three different ways in which, the three different types of economies or economic relations, just to use his words here, in which these debts are either ignored or they are rejected or they are somehow dealt with. The first one is communism, the second is a market, and the third is a gift. Now he argues that in all societies, in every society, you have different ways. All three are working at the same time, even though, sometimes we might want to ignore that there's only one of them, but he doesn't see, for example, he says in capitalism, for example, the communism is among the rich is probably the most, works the best way. So even though we often think about, capitalism, or at least communism, is opposed to capitalism, but the rich among themselves, they constantly help each other. They always are to their service each other. So they practice a kind of communism that defies everything that they think is true about the world and the economy. So he says that these three moral principles of economic relations basically work in different ways in societies, and one can basically see them, fulfilling debts or evade, or at least working with debts and obligations through this way. Either you all, disavowing any kind of debt to each other, or you are trading with each other, or you are trading gifts with each other, which is somewhat a type of a market exchange, but it's a market exchange that is never equivalent. In addition to that, and there's one more thing that I want to say about something very distinctive that Graeber says about modernity or debts in modernity. Modernity is defined by a myth of equal exchange. And that myth has actually been produced by the production of money, by the emergence of money as a symbol of exchange. I encourage you to read his book, Debt 5,000 Years. I will just present to you this as a major myth. He calls it the myth of equal exchange, because when you interrogate these exchanges that are taking place, how value is produced in the society, then you actually see that it appears to be equal, but it is not that equal. And we can see we can see much more of that in terms of how different kinds of work is valued, how different currencies are valued. All of that sort of always tends to create a myth that everything can be calculated mathematically or rationally or through a spreadsheet, but at the end of the day, it works only because there is a myth of equal exchange that is animating this. What happens through this myth of exchange mainly is that real debts are hidden by this myth. The real debts that are actually taking place, and those debts are created by the role of the state and the banks, how money is created, and therefore people are indebted to the banks, or people are indebted to the state. Fundamentally is that all of these kind of hidden myths are not always interrogated as carefully as the equal exchange. Or for example, the famous example that he gives is, the American Sixth Fleet is all over the world, for example. The army is there ready to defend its interests, just in case you don't know it. So we will work with free exchange, but if you don't behave yourself, then we'll send the army. Or if we think you don't behave yourself, that you're putting the price of petrol too high, then we basically deal with you. So I think Graeber presents a very stark reality, almost confirming what T.P. Thompson saying, that at the end of the day, you basically have a market economy that is hegemonic, that is actually suppressing other kinds of economies, other kinds of moral economies, and that's what you look at. Okay, so what do we do with what does the study of religions and moral have to do with moral economies? I have a short review. I don't know, I haven't been checking my time, but maybe if you could just tell me.
You have about 7 minutes.
Oh, no, okay, I'm well in time. Yeah, okay, great. So I'm not going to sacrifice this one. I have my debt towards my scholarly community, that I have to basically say what they have done. So the market economy certainly has been at least the moral economies have received attention from students of religions, but almost all of them emphasize, or at least recognize, the hegemonic market economy. And I'm speaking specifically about Webb Keene's work, his recent essay, sort of overarching essay, which is a good essay. And he starts off by saying, at the end of the day, we are living in a market economy, and that's the way things are. It's almost like it's a fact of life. Charles Tripp also mentions that, but he does it in a slightly different way, and I'm going to come to him in a minute. So there's a sense, there's a recognition, there's an acceptance almost that the market economy is hegemonic. In fact, one can look at social theories. Some recent social theories nowadays, the rational choice theory has actually, receded a little bit. But at one time, we used to see all of sociological phenomena as rational choice theories. To a certain extent, one can see Bourdieu's work also as a kind of a rational action theory. I mean, particularly in the terms it uses. I know it's a bit more complex than that. We had it yesterday in our presentation, but certainly I think that much of his work, by thinking about social capital and habitus as such, it fits into this kind of market about how social movements actually work within markets. But I do think that if we pause a little bit and not only look at what has happened in the more recent past, maybe we should remember resistance to moral economy of the market. We should look at religions as resisting the moral economy. And I think liberation theologians, theologists, both in South America and then throughout the world, we need to pay attention to them as alternative moral economies, resisting the moral economy of the market. I think there's much more that needs to be said about them. And perhaps we can revisit our understandings of these liberation theologies as moral economies and not just simply as alternative, alternate definition. So Charles Tripp, which I mentioned just now, I mean, his book is quite interesting because he traces a Islamic reformist discourse all the way from Sayyid Qutb, Ali Shariati, many of those people who are considered to be really dangerous nowadays in the 21st century because they are supposed to have inspired, ISIS and all of these terrible people. But they were the first ones to raise questions about, the market economy, and they thought, and they were trying to argue, develop their arguments, or at least develop a proposal for an Islamic moral economy that was opposed to the market economy. I know Faisal's paper today perhaps puts the span in the work a little bit, but I will still have to think about this. Charles Tripp does conclude by suggesting that the emergence of Islamic banking basically is a capitulation, of Islamic economics to the moral economy. So he shows the history of people, resisting the market economy, and then eventually the market economy actually takes over and also colonizes the religious space as well. But I want to keep a little bit space for that resistance a little bit more, that I think one needs to revisit and not just give up, just as because the market economy is a fact of life. More recent studies, I think, have emphasized this kind of the confluence between religion and market, or what I would like to call it as a capitulation, of religion to the market. So let me perhaps, start with, the Protestant reform. Sorry, I got Charles Adams wrong. I was thinking about another person right now, but I'm talking about, Adam Smith there. So the Protestant reform, by Adam Smith and then later by Max Weber, maybe one should begin to think of this as a justification or a kind of a, capitulation to the market rather than, than an inspiration for the market. So I was just thinking that maybe we should bring in these earlier discourses of the market, into our discussion as well. In the case of the study of Islam, there has, people like Rudnicki and Osella, they have been working on India and Indonesia, where they suggest that Islam has the resources for producing the same kind of capitalist production and capitalist market relations as Christianity or as the West has done. It's almost like saying that, well, Muslims can also be modern, but now they can also be capitalist. So I think market Islam, is true, perhaps. I'm not saying it's not necessarily true, but I think that it represents perhaps the what they call the confluence of capital and religion and Islam, what I would like to think of as a capitulation to market. And then I was also thinking about prosperity gospels as requiring a very careful, I mean, it has been done by people like Uka and others, who have identified the market of these prosperity gospels as a confluence of religion and the market as well. But maybe we need to revisit that in the light of what I'm going to be concluding right now. So what I would like to conclude with is actually to start talking about where we should take this, where we might want to take the study of moral economy and religions as such. I would say that we should begin with the assumption that religious reform is a form of resistance opposition. It might not be perfect. So just for the fact that religious reform is a place that perhaps these religious groups claim that they are different, and their followers also accept them to be different. I think that should be an opportunity to start paying attention to what they say as a moral economy. I mean, we might decide that they are not very different from capitalist market economy, but at least one can begin from that place as such. I'm not denying that the moral economy cannot be found elsewhere, you know, but on the other hand, I think that maybe religious reform is possibly a good place to be good place to start, start interrogating, starting to look at the moral economy again, all this alternative moral economy that Thompson and others speak about, precisely because it is an attempt to try and go against the norm as such. I think one of the questions that what I would like to ask is, drawing on Graeber, is what is the religious discourse of deaths in a particular religious tradition or in a particular religious group? What is the discourse on deaths? And what do I mean by that? What do I mean by religious discourse? I mean, this is the term that I've been working on for a long time. So I'd like to present this time as one might begin with asking, what is the source of death, according to a particular religious group or particular religious reformist group? I've listed these questions because I've taken them from the Quran, in my case, because I've been reading and thinking about this. Maybe we need to start looking at life, the earth, history, delivery from oppression, thinking about the Israelites, or threats, or agreements. All of these I've found to be quite important uh, reasons or justifications or reasons for why we are in debt, why human beings are in debt. So, like I suggested to you, from the sacrifice all the way to agreements that we make with each other, religions always say, you have to hold on to your agreement, which is also a kind of a debt. So, we might be open ourselves to the way in which a debt is manifested. Our debt is actually created. That would be a good way to begin begin with an understanding of a religious discourse. And then our next statement that I think that should help us to see how a religious discourse works is, how do we repay or redeem those debts? So I think that we might look at many others. We must be open to different possibilities, but at least from what we know about religions, we know that there are sacrifices. Maybe it's a sacrifice of an animal, but it can also be something much less dramatic. But we might begin with that. Is this a gift, or is this perhaps a substitute? Like we know in so many of the sacrifices, the sacrifice of Abraham, or the sacrifice of, what if I may call it, the sacrifice of Jesus, for example, or it's a sacrifice that people do on a regular basis. Sacrifice can be an important way of thinking about gift and a substitute. How a discourse imposes fines, and this would be including performing rituals, but sometimes it would be monetary fines. I mean, that would be an important way of beginning to see how debts are redeemed or how they are repaid. How to cancel debts. So forgiveness might be a way of thinking about, okay, we will cancel the debts. But I mean, obviously there's much more that needs to be said, but I'm just giving you sort of a broad, hopefully some ideas or some suggestions of where to go with this religious discourse of debts. How to perhaps escape debts, how to completely, say that you don't want to have anything to do with this world. I think in religious traditions that is best expressed perhaps in asceticism, in a way of going completely against this moral economy, even the moral economy that is set up by religious traditions. And then finally, I think what is very important for our project, especially if we do it in modern times, is that we cannot avoid this question. What has happened to the religious discourse of debt under the moral economy of the market? So I think while one might want to think about, alternative economies, I think that I cannot, escape from this idea of the market economy as being dominant. So in a way, I do not like it, but I actually also have to accept it as something that affects religious discourse as well. So I think that therefore religious discourse should not only be looked at in a particular moment in time, but also over a long period of time. That religious discourse should actually be a study of religious discourse should actually be concerned about its transformation and its change over a period of time. I think that may help us to identify, this kind of the discourse of debt in a more clear way. I also think, and perhaps if I could elaborate what I asked Faisal to do right now, and I asked him the question about, why I think that what I'm identifying is that there are, a discourse is not just simply kind of an embodiment of moral value. It is that. It's not only the material of moral value, but it is also a debate going on in societies. So a discourse has to take into consideration alternative or different ways in which people are constructing these alternatives. So when you have religious reform groups or ideas coming up that present these alternatives or present these ideas, you always have reactions taking place, either between the religious discourse and the market economy, and sometimes even often also among the religious groups themselves. And I think one has to bring that into consideration as well. So I was thinking of answering these questions somewhat, but I thought 15 minutes is not going to be enough for this, so maybe another time. Thank you.